I think it's about time we talk about an interesting phenomenon when it comes to Nintendo news coverage. Something that I don't think a lot of people outside this channel have noticed. I don't know if this is like something that has been observed in other circles, but it's certainly not something that's talked about in YouTube or NeoGAF or any of these other like hardcore gaming outlets, right? Nobody wants to admit this. Nobody wants to say this is true. But the reality is that Nintendo is winning the console war. However, right, whenever this happens, and this has happened several times in the past, Super Nintendo, Wii, and now the Switch, like every time this happens, like people try and downplay the situation. Is that they'll try to say like, Switch isn't Nintendo isn't in competition with the others. Like PlayStation and Xbox are for the real hardcore gamer, and Nintendo is just an interesting sideshow. They've always done this, right? They've also always done this with like their handheld divisions in particular, right? Like if you take handhelds into account, Nintendo has always been dominant in the gaming industry, but like everybody likes to pretend that like Pokemon doesn't exist, that the Game Boy wasn't the biggest thing ever, that like the DS was as big as it was. Like nobody wants to admit any of that, right? They just want to like refuse to admit it and like try and write it off, like try to say that like phones are going to kill that, which didn't actually happen, of course, but. We've seen this consistently over the past like 25 years, right? That people don't want to admit that Nintendo is doing better than its competition, that it's dominating, that it is better than the stuff that's coming out on other platforms, that it is making more money, that they have way better budgets, and that they have a way stronger branding. Like when you compare where like Nintendo is at right now with PlayStation, the difference is laughable. 20 years ago, you had like the Crash Bandicoot guy coming out and like saying that like, oh man, Miyamoto really fumbled the ball with Super Mario Sunshine. He should have done what we did with Jak 2, right? And then like meanwhile, what happens after that? Like Nintendo puts out Mario Galaxy. They put out New Super Mario Bros. They put out like 3D World. They put out Odyssey. And like, what has Jak got? Like, what has Naughty Dog done? Like in the past like 20 years, jack shit. Nothing they've produced has been of value. Nothing. They have never been good, right? Ever. Their best game, Jak, and the Precursor's Legacy, like Jak 1, that was a Banjo-Kazooie knockoff. Nobody wants to admit it. Nobody acknowledges that at all, but the best game Naughty Dog ever produced was a knockoff of Rareware's knockoff of Super Mario 64. Right? Like, that is hilarious to me. That is really, really funny. Like, nobody who's played, like, all three will tell you that, like, Jak and the Precursor Legacy is better than Banjo or Super Mario 64. Right? And that's kind of where we're at now, where people are, like, trying to pretend as if like PlayStation had like some crazy hidden gems that were like better than like the classic Nintendo games, right? Better than Ocarina, better than Super Mario 64, better than Pokemon, better than Super Metroid, better than like, Pikmin or Super Smash Bros. Melee. Like there are like dozens and hundreds and millions of classic PlayStation games just hiding out of sight that like millions of people love them and adore them, and that's why PlayStation became successful. That isn't true, right? Like we know that like most of these games only sold because of like hype from the gaming media, like pretending these games were on the same level of quality as their Nintendo equivalents. But we know that isn't true, right? Banjo-Kazooie versus Croc and the Legend of the Gabos is a really good example in which they both sold around the same amount of units, but Banjo-Kazooie became a beloved classic and Croc was relatively forgotten because Banjo-Kazooie was a much better game. And we're now seeing that happen with dozens of other games throughout the years, right? Games that were written off 10 years ago, like Skyward Sword, like Kid Icarus Uprising, like Pikmin 3 are becoming phenomenally successful due to re-releases or a demand for a re-release, right? These games have become major cult classics. These games have a following. These games are beloved. And that is because their branding is so strong. You're not seeing anybody ask for a Jak remaster, right? Or a Jak remake or Crash Bandicoot 4. You're not seeing anybody line up for oh man, I wonder what they're gonna do with The Last of Us Part 3. It's done. It's over. It's done and dusted. The PlayStation cannot compete right? Like, that's the reality, but nobody wants to admit it. Like, whenever we're in this kind of position, which is quite often, in which Nintendo is dominating the console industry, people always want to pretend otherwise. They always want to, like, downplay everything they're putting out, pretend that, like, the sales don't matter, that they're going to fall off a cliff soon, that the Switch is reaching the end of its lifespan, that the Switch 2 is on the horizon. How many times over the past several years, like every Nintendo Switch financial report, it feels like, have we heard that, like, the Switch is not going to outsell the PS2? And yet it is going to happen within the next 2 to 3 years, right? Like, it is going to soar way past the PS2 and become the best-selling console ever. And there's nothing that anyone can do to stop it. Games like Tears of the Kingdom are going to be beloved as some of the best games ever made. And just more and more, I think, it's going to become indisputable that Nintendo is king of the video game industry, right? Like, I think we're kind of reaching the point where, like, it's going to be really hard, impossible, to downplay Nintendo brands the way that they were traditionally downplayed. Because what they used to do was just hype up other games from similar genres, or, like, claim that they were more mature, had, like, more engaging stories or better graphics, and, like, basically none of that is true anymore. And, like, anybody who, like, even remotely follows this stuff is aware of it, right? Like, maybe some, like, casual gamers still get excited over, like, the new Call of Duty or the new GTA, but like when all is said and done, like, when you compare, like, Zelda versus Red Dead Redemption 2, the difference in quality is absolutely staggering, right? There is nothing that Red Dead Redemption 2 does better than Breath of the Wild. Like, nothing. It was completely stopped. Like, if it wasn't for the brand, if it wasn't for, like, Rockstar Games being, like, the most beloved video game developer among normies, like, there would be no, like, debate about that at all, right? Like, Red Dead Redemption 2 was complete trash, and nobody wants to admit it. But, like, so many people came up, like, trying to downplay Breath of the Wild, specifically to try and prevent this from happening, preventing Nintendo from being seen as the dominant force in the gaming industry.